The Veltar Empire had observed Earth for 37 standard cycles before making their assessment. Through their quantum surveillance arrays, they watched humanity stumble through wars, succumb to disease, and fracture into countless feuding nations. Their xenobiologists classified humans as a Category 7 species, technologically primitive, emotionally unstable, and utterly incapable of unified action. High Stratarch Nixara reviewed the final invasion proposal in her crystalline command chamber, aboard the dreadnought hegemonic Dawn. The data was conclusive. Humans possessed no energy shields, their weapons were chemically propelled projectiles, and their largest vessels couldn't even leave their home system. Most tellingly, they couldn't agree on basic planetary governance, let alone mount a coordinated defense. "Begin the subjugation protocol," she commanded, her bioluminescent crest pulsing with satisfaction. "Standard pacification doctrine. They'll surrender within one solar rotation." The first wave descended on 17 major population centers simultaneously. Gravity disruptors flattened military installations, while neural dampening fields should have rendered human resistance impossible. The Veltar had perfected this technique across 43 conquered worlds. But something went catastrophically wrong. Instead of cowering, humans did something the Veltar database contained no protocols for. They improvised. When electromagnetic pulses disabled their sophisticated equipment, they reverted to mechanical systems. When neural dampeners clouded their thoughts, they relied on muscle memory and instinct. Most perplexingly, when their governments collapsed, ordinary citizens began organizing themselves into effective resistance cells. In Mumbai, a street food vendor named Rashta began coordinating supply lines for resistance fighters using nothing but a network of delivery drivers. In Detroit, factory worker Kazmira retrofitted automobile assembly lines to produce improvised weapons. In São Paulo, former rivals from different favelas united under a graffiti artist called Vento, turning urban warfare into a deadly art form. The Veltar's advanced tactical computers couldn't process the chaos. Their algorithms were designed to predict the behavior of logical, hierarchical societies. They had no framework for understanding a species that seemed to thrive on unpredictability. Within hours, human fighters were using captured Veltar equipment against them. A group of teenagers in Seoul, led by a competitive gamer named Yundal, had somehow reverse-engineered their energy weapons by treating them like puzzle games. In the Australian outback, Aboriginal elders like Warangara were teaching alien technology to respond to traditional tracking methods that predated written history. Most disturbing of all was the humans' complete disregard for acceptable losses. Veltar doctrine assumed that any species would surrender once casualties reached 12% of the population. Humans seemed to fight harder the more desperate their situation became. High Stratarch Nixara watched her casualty reports with growing alarm. The invasion fleet was losing ships not to superior technology, but to tactics that violated every principle of civilized warfare. Humans were ramming damaged vessels into their formations, using their own cities as elaborate traps, and employing suicide tactics that defied all logic. Stratarch, her tactical advisor Keltum reported, his usually steady voice trembling. "We've lost contact with 17 ground assault teams. The humans, they're using improvised explosives hidden in their own dead." Nixara's crest dimmed to a sickly yellow. In all her cycles of conquest, she had never encountered a species that treated warfare as a creative exercise rather than a logical problem to be solved. "Signal the fleet," she commanded grimly. "We're withdrawing to orbital analysis positions. We need to understand what we're truly facing before we proceed." The Veltar Empire had just encountered their first tactical retreat in over 2 centuries. The withdrawal sent shockwaves through the Veltar Hegemonic Council. For the first time in their recorded history, a primitive species had forced their military into a strategic retreat. Emergency sessions convened across 3 star systems as military analysts, Xenobiologists and cultural theorists struggled to comprehend what had occurred on Earth. Fleet Admiral Zefrock, a veteran of 17 successful conquests, found himself reassigned from frontline duty to head the newly formed Human Analysis Division. The humiliation burned in his thoracic chambers, but even he had to admit that traditional conquest doctrine had failed spectacularly. "We approach them as we would any logical species," he explained to the assembled research team aboard the massive analysis vessel Cognitive Dissonance. "We targeted their military capabilities, disrupted their communications, and eliminated their leadership structures. By all mathematical models, they should have surrendered immediately." Dr. Yehiva Nas, the hegemony's leading xenopsychologist, studied the holographic displays showing human resistance tactics. Her species' evolution had prioritized logical thinking and efficient problem-solving. Watching humans deliberately choose seemingly irrational strategies was like observing creatures that could survive by breaking the laws of physics. "Look at this behavioral pattern," she gestured to a tactical replay from Lagos. "Their military installation was destroyed within the first wave. Standard doctrine suggests they should have fled to secondary positions. Instead, they remained in the ruins and began using the debris as weapons." The footage showed a human named Oluwande leading a group of civilians in turning twisted metal and rubble into an intricate network of traps and ambush points. When Veltar ground forces moved in to secure the area, they found themselves caught in a maze where every piece of wreckage had been deliberately positioned to channel them into kill zones. "Their tactics have no basis in military science," observed combat analyst Krixtal. This Oluwanda had no formal military training. He was classified as a construction engineer in their civilian infrastructure, yet he demonstrated battlefield innovation that surpassed our senior tactical officers. The research team began conducting detailed behavioral studies, intercepting human communications, and analyzing their decision-making processes. What they discovered challenged every assumption about intelligence and survival. Humans seemed to possess a cognitive adaptation the Veltar had never encountered, the ability to find patterns and solutions in apparent chaos. Where Veltar minds saw disorder and inefficiency, human brains identified opportunities and connections. Dr. Hivanas documented case after case of impossible human adaptations. In Nairobi, a veterinarian named Mwangi had studied captured Veltar biosuits and discovered that the same antibiotics used to treat livestock diseases could disable their life support systems. In Reykjavik, geothermal engineer Björn Dottir had figured out how to overload Veltar energy shields using principles borrowed from volcanic steam pressure. Most fascinating was their collaborative behavior under extreme stress. The Veltar had observed human societies fragmenting during peacetime over trivial resource disputes. Yet under existential threat, humans exhibited unprecedented cooperation across all previously insurmountable social barriers. Their neural architecture appears to contain redundant problem-solving pathways, Dr. Yivanas reported to the Hegemonic Council via quantum transmission. When conventional solutions fail, they automatically shift to alternative cognitive models. It's as if their brains treat impossible situations as creative challenges rather than logical problems. Fleet Admiral Zefrock found himself grudgingly admiring the human resistance leaders. Commander Fatima Zahra in Cairo had somehow convinced the local Veltar garrison that she was attempting to surrender, then used the negotiation meetings to gather detailed intelligence on their operational procedures. By the time the Veltar realized they were being studied rather than bargaining for surrender, she had already disseminated their tactical weaknesses across the global resistance network. The most disturbing revelation came from communications. Intercepts. Humans weren't just adapting to Veltar technology, they were beginning to understand it better than its creators. Teams of human engineers, scientists, and even artists were collaborating to reverse engineer systems that had taken the Veltar centuries to perfect. "Request immediate reinforcements," Zefrock transmitted to High Command. "This isn't a conquest anymore. It's a race to understand them before they fully understand us. 6 months into the analysis phase, the Veltar research teams had accumulated more behavioral data on humans than any species in their archives. Yet every discovery seemed to deepen the mystery rather than solve it. The humans weren't just resisting, they were evolving their tactics faster than the Veltar could adapt to them. Dr. Yavanas had requested a direct neural interface with captured human subjects, hoping to understand their cognitive processes from within. The Hegemonic Council initially approved the procedure, considering it a necessary sacrifice in the name of scientific advancement. However, the results were so disturbing that 3 senior researchers requested immediate reassignment to other projects. The first subject was Kamalesh, a former philosophy professor from Mumbai who had been captured while leading a successful raid on a Veltar supply depot. Under neural interface, Dr. Yehivanas expected to find the chaotic, illogical thought patterns that characterized most primitive species. Instead, she encountered something that challenged her understanding of consciousness itself. The human mind doesn't process information linearly, she reported in her classified briefing to Fleet Admiral Zefrock. When facing an impossible situation, they don't simply calculate solutions. They imagine new realities where solutions become possible. The neural scans revealed that when Kamalesh planned his attacks, his brain simultaneously considered dozens of potential scenarios, many of which violated basic physical laws. But rather than discarding these impossible options, his mind used them as starting points to discover overlooked possibilities within actual constraints. He's not just thinking tactically, Dr. Yavanas continued, her bioluminescent nodes flickering with uncertainty. He's thinking metatactically. He anticipates our anticipation of his tactics, then creates strategies based on manipulating our predictions of his behavior. Meanwhile, human resistance had entered a new phase. Leaders like Yukimura in Osaka had begun deliberately sharing false intelligence, knowing the Veltar were monitoring their communications. They created elaborate deception campaigns that fed their observers carefully crafted misinformation, leading Veltar forces into situations where human advantages became decisive. In Stockholm, a former game designer named Larsson had convinced his cell to treat the entire war as a massive strategy game. They began analyzing Veltar behavior patterns and identifying exploitable bugs in their tactical protocols. Within weeks, they were predicting Veltar movements with greater accuracy than the Veltar themselves. The breakthrough that shattered Veltar confidence came from an unexpected source. Ashanti, a marine biologist from the Seychelles, had been studying captured Veltar equipment and noticed that their quantum processors operated on principles similar to dolphin echolocation. Working with a team that included a jazz musician, a quantum physicist, and a traditional weaver, she developed a method of using sound frequencies to disrupt Veltar technology at the quantum level. "This is impossible," combat analyst Krixtal protested when reviewing the intelligence reports. "They've weaponized music theory against our most advanced military systems. Our own scientists assured us that such an approach would require centuries of research to develop." Fleet Admiral Zefrock studied the tactical summaries with growing unease. The humans were no longer simply defending themselves. They were beginning to hunt Veltar forces with increasing effectiveness. More disturbing, they seemed to be enjoying the challenge. Intercepted communications revealed humans discussing Veltar tactics with the same enthusiasm they once reserved for recreational activities. Resistance fighters were comparing successful operations like athletes celebrating victories, sharing techniques and innovations with a passion that bordered on artistic expression. "They're treating warfare as a creative medium," Dr. Yevanas observed during one of her analysis sessions. "For most species, conflict is a necessary evil to be concluded as efficiently as possible. For humans, it appears to be an opportunity for collaborative innovation." The Veltar command structure began experiencing something unprecedented in their military history: strategic paralysis. Every tactical doctrine they attempted was rapidly decoded and countered by human forces who seemed to treat each new challenge as an interesting puzzle rather than a life-threatening crisis. High Stratarch Nix Ara received reports that human resistance cells were now actively seeking out Veltar patrols, using increasingly sophisticated techniques to capture technology and personnel for study. The prey had become the predator, and the Veltar found themselves being analyzed with the same methodical precision they had once applied to their victims. Perhaps, Dr. Yvanas suggested in her latest report, we have fundamentally misunderstood the nature of intelligence itself. The transformation was complete. What had begun as a routine subjugation had evolved into a nightmare scenario that no Veltar strategist had ever contemplated. Human resistance forces were no longer reacting to Veltar initiatives. They were setting the terms of engagement, forcing their former oppressors into increasingly defensive positions. Veltar casualties mounted steadily as human tactics grew more sophisticated. The breakthrough came when resistance cells began sharing a discovery made by Dmitrienko, a former circus performer from Kiev. He had observed that Veltar soldiers moved in predictable patterns based on their hierarchical conditioning, creating exploitable blind spots in their formation tactics. Working with Nkemka, a game theorist from Abuja, and Ravi Kiran, a street magician from Delhi, Dmitrienko developed what humans called chaos protocols, combat strategies based on deliberate unpredictability that leveraged Veltar psychological limitations. Their minds are optimized for order and efficiency, Nkemka explained in an intercepted transmission to other resistance leaders. They literally cannot process truly random behavior because their neural architecture filters out information that doesn't fit established patterns. We can hide in plain sight by acting in ways their brains refuse to recognize as threatening. The Sati results were devastating. Veltar patrols found themselves walking into ambushes that their sensors couldn't detect because the attack patterns violated their predictive algorithms. Human fighters began using techniques borrowed from improvisational theater, creating combat scenarios that changed faster than Veltar tactical computers could recalculate responses. Dr. Yvanas watched the tactical recordings with a mixture of fascination and horror. In Barcelona, a former flamenco dancer named Carmen Luz had taught her resistance cell to move in rhythmic patterns that confused Veltar targeting systems. The aliens' sensors were designed to track logical movement, trajectories. But Carmen de Luz's fighters flowed like dancers, making their positions impossible to predict. "They're not just defeating our technology," she reported to an increasingly desperate command structure. "They're revealing fundamental flaws in our entire approach to problem solving." The most humiliating defeat came at the hands of a 12-year-old human named Zainab in Cairo. The child had been studying captured Veltar communication equipment as if it were a puzzle toy. Within 3 days, she had not only decoded their encryption protocols, but had begun sending false orders to Veltar units, convincing them to attack each other. A juvenile member of their species accomplished in days what our cryptographic specialists insisted was impossible, Fleet Admiral Zefrock reported to the Hegemonic Council. She treated our military-grade security as a game and solved it with the same methods she used for recreational challenges. Human innovation accelerated exponentially. Resistance networks began sharing discoveries instantaneously across the planet, creating a collective intelligence that surpassed anything in Veltar experience. A breakthrough in São Paulo would be implemented in Seoul within hours, then improved upon in Stockholm and shared again before the Veltar could develop countermeasures. The aliens found themselves fighting not just individual human groups, but a globally distributed organism that learned and adapted faster than their command structure could respond. Every tactical victory was temporary, as humans absorbed the lessons and developed more effective responses. Worse, humans had begun psychological warfare campaigns specifically designed to exploit Veltar mental conditioning. A former advertising executive named Madison Ray in Chicago had analyzed Veltar communication intercepts and identified specific sound frequencies and visual patterns that induced anxiety in their neural architecture. Resistance cells began broadcasting these patterns alongside their conventional attacks, causing Veltar soldiers to experience unprecedented psychological stress. For a species that had evolved in ordered hierarchical societies, the combination of unpredictable tactics and targeted mental disruption proved overwhelming. "We're receiving reports of combat stress syndrome throughout the fleet," Dr. BlackHFY informed HFY during their weekly analysis meeting. "Our soldiers are beginning to exhibit behavioral patterns consistent with severe anxiety disorders. Some are refusing to engage human forces entirely." The Admiral's bioluminescent crest had dimmed to a dull gray, a sign of deep distress among his species. "How many of our personnel are affected?" 73% of ground forces are showing symptoms. Fleet crews are beginning to request reassignment to any other theater of operations. Dr. BlackHFY paused, her voice dropping to barely audible levels. "Admiral, we may need to consider the possibility that humans represent a form of intelligence we are simply incapable of defeating through conventional means. For the first time in Veltar military history, an invasion force was experiencing systematic demoralization at the hands of a supposedly primitive species. The Veltar Hegemonic Council convened an emergency session as reports from Earth grew, increasingly desperate. High Counselor Thexalon reviewed the military analysis with growing disbelief. In 18 months, a routine conquest had devolved into the most significant crisis in their species' recorded history. "Explain to me," Thexalon demanded of the assembled experts, "how a primitive species with no interstellar capability has reduced our finest military forces to a state of complete tactical confusion." Fleet Admiral HFY, his once proud bearing now diminished by months of impossible defeats, stepped forward. "Honored Counselor, we have fundamentally misunderstood the nature of human intelligence. Our classification systems are inadequate to describe what we're facing." Dr. BlackHFY had spent the past months in intensive analysis of human behavioral patterns, and her conclusions challenged everything the Veltar thought they knew about consciousness and intelligence. "Counselor, I request permission to present findings that may require us to completely revise our understanding of evolutionary development." "Proceed," Thexalon commanded, though his bioluminescent patterns betrayed deep skepticism. "Humans didn't evolve for efficiency or logical optimization like most intelligent species," Dr. BlackHFY began. "Their neural architecture developed in response to environments that were constantly changing and unpredictable. Where we evolved to find the single best solution to any problem, they evolved to generate multiple simultaneous solutions and adapt them in real time." She activated the holographic display, showing comparative brain scans between Veltar and human subjects. "Notice how our neural pathways are highly organized and specialized. Human brains show massive redundancy and cross-connectivity. What we initially interpreted as inefficiency is actually a sophisticated adaptation for handling chaos." The recording showed human resistance leaders making tactical decisions through processes that seemed to violate basic logic. A team led by Indira Jyoti in Mumbai had successfully predicted Veltar movements by using meditation techniques combined with probability mathematics and intuitive pattern recognition, an approach that no Veltar tactical computer could replicate. "They don't just think differently," Dr. BlackHFY continued. "They think in ways that are literally impossible for our neural architecture to process. When we analyze their strategies, we're seeing only the parts our minds can comprehend. The full picture remains invisible to us." The most disturbing revelation came from intercepted human communications discussing Veltar weaknesses. Not only had humans identified exploitable flaws in Veltar technology and tactics, but they had developed a frighteningly accurate understanding of Veltar psychology and decision-making processes. "They're studying us," combat analyst Krikstal reported, his voice barely steady. Human research teams have been systematically analyzing our behavior patterns, and they understand our military doctrine better than we do ourselves. The evidence was overwhelming. Human forces had begun predicting Veltar tactical decisions with near-perfect accuracy, not through superior technology, but through pattern recognition capabilities that treated warfare as a complex behavioral puzzle. Anya Sol, a former ballet instructor from Moscow, had developed what humans called predictive choreography, reading Veltar formation movements like dance sequences and anticipating their next tactical positions. Her resistance cell hadn't lost a single engagement in 4 months because they knew where Veltar forces would be before the Veltar commanders had finished planning their movements. We trained for scenarios where we faced opposition with inferior technology but equivalent logical thinking, Fleet Admiral Zefrock admitted. We never prepared for enemies whose intelligence operates on completely different principles. High Counselor Thexelon reviewed the tactical summaries with growing alarm. Human casualties were decreasing, while their operational effectiveness increased exponentially. More disturbing, humans seemed to be enjoying the conflict, treating each engagement as an opportunity for creative problem-solving rather than a desperate struggle for survival. "What are you recommending?" Thexelon asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "Complete strategic reassessment," Dr. Hivanas replied. "We need to understand that humans represent a form of intelligence that may be inherently superior to our own for certain types of problem-solving. They're not primitive. They're optimized for different challenges than we initially recognized." The silence in the council chamber stretched for long moments as the implications became clear. The Veltar Empire, built on the assumption of their intellectual superiority, had encountered a species that challenged their fundamental worldview. "There's something else," Dr. Yivanas added quietly. "Our analysis suggests that this conflict has accelerated human technological development by several centuries. They're beginning to understand principles of quantum mechanics and energy manipulation through pure experimentation and intuitive reasoning. If we continue this engagement much longer, they may develop capabilities that exceed our own." The unthinkable had become reality. The hunters had become the hunted, and the prey was evolving faster than the predators could adapt. Dr. Hivanas stood before the Veltar High Command with data that would reshape their understanding of intelligence itself. The holographic displays showed human technological advancement curves that defied every known model of species development. In 22 months of conflict, humans have made technological leaps that should have required centuries, she reported, her bioluminescent patterns flickering with barely contained excitement. "They're not just using our technology against us, they're improving it beyond our original specifications." The evidence was undeniable. Taroshin, a former electronics engineer from Tokyo, had reverse-engineered Veltar quantum processors and somehow increased their efficiency by 30%. His modifications violated several supposedly fundamental laws of quantum mechanics, yet the improved devices worked flawlessly. More alarming was the collaboration between Priya Devi, a classical musician from Chennai, and Omar Hassan, a theoretical physicist from Alexandria. Together, they had discovered that certain musical harmonies could manipulate quantum fields in ways that Veltar science insisted were impossible. Their harmonic resonance weapons were now being deployed by resistance cells worldwide. They're treating our most advanced technology like raw materials for artistic expression, combat analyst Krikstal observed. "A group of humans in Berlin, led by someone called Klaus Meyer, have turned our gravity manipulation systems into sculptural installations that somehow enhance their defensive capabilities." Fleet Admiral Zefrock studied the intelligence reports with growing unease. The humans weren't just winning battles. They were rewriting the rules of engagement entirely. Traditional concepts of military superiority had become meaningless when facing opponents who treated warfare as collaborative creative expression. The breakthrough that terrified Veltar Command came from an unlikely source. Elenikov, a former circus acrobat from Prague, had been experimenting with captured Veltar flight systems. Instead of trying to understand the technical specifications, she approached the technology as if it were a new form of physical performance art. Within weeks, she had developed flight techniques that surpassed anything in Veltar aerospace doctrine. Her resistance cell was now conducting three-dimensional combat operations that Veltar pilots couldn't follow, let alone counter. Elenikov's fighters moved through space like dancers, creating impossible trajectories that seemed to mock the laws of physics. "They're not bound by our assumptions about what's possible," Dr. Yevanaz explained to the increasingly desperate command staff. "Where we see technological limitations, they see creative challenges. They're discovering capabilities in our own equipment that we never knew existed." The psychological warfare campaign had evolved beyond anything the Veltar could comprehend. Joaquin Vargas, a former theatrical director from Mexico City, had organized resistance cells into elaborate performance pieces designed to induce specific emotional responses in Veltar observers. His terror ballets combined combat tactics with psychological manipulation, creating scenarios where Veltar soldiers experienced existential confusion while under attack. The performances were so effective that some Veltar units had begun refusing orders to engage human forces entirely. "We're losing operational cohesion," Fleet Admiral Zefrock admitted during his private consultation with Dr. Yevanaz. "Our soldiers are exhibiting symptoms we don't have names for. Some are requesting memory modification to forget their encounters with human forces." The most disturbing development was the emergence of human strategic thinkers who seemed to understand Veltar psychology better than the Veltar themselves. Kwame Asante, a former anthropologist from Accra, had developed what humans called alien behavioral prediction models that allowed resistance forces to manipulate Veltar decision-making processes. His techniques were so effective that human forces had begun setting elaborate traps where Veltar commanders would make exactly the tactical choices that led to their own defeat. The Veltar found themselves being herded into disadvantageous positions by opponents who understood their behavioral patterns better than they did. "We're not fighting a war anymore," Dr. Yevanaz concluded in her final report to the Hegemonic Council. "We're being systematically deconstructed by a form of intelligence that operates on principles we can't fully comprehend. Every engagement teaches them more about us while revealing how little we truly understand about them." The data was clear. Human forces had achieved technological parity with Veltar equipment and were beginning to develop capabilities that exceeded their oppressors' original specifications. More significantly, they had achieved complete psychological dominance over Veltar military forces through techniques that transformed warfare into performance art. "What do you recommend?" High Counselor Thexelon asked, though his dimming bioluminescence suggested he already knew the answer. "Complete withdrawal and immediate negotiation for peaceful coexistence," Dr. Yevanaz replied without hesitation. "Humans represent a form of intelligence that may be inherently superior to our own. Continued conflict will only accelerate their development while further degrading our operational capabilities." For the first time in their history, the Veltar Empire was preparing to request terms from a species they had initially dismissed as primitive. The negotiation chambers aboard the neutral station Confluence Point had never hosted talks between such dramatically mismatched opponents. High Counselor Thexelon led the Veltar delegation, while humanity was represented by an eclectic group that perfectly embodied their species' unconventional approach to everything. The human delegation included Abebi Tunde, a former UN mediator. From Lagos, Yuen Li, a quantum physicist turned philosopher from Hong Kong, and Mikhail Ovich, a jazz composer from St. Petersburg whose pattern recognition abilities had proven crucial in decoding Veltar behavioral psychology. Perhaps most significantly, they had brought Zara Moon, a 10-year-old mathematical prodigy from Nairobi whose insights into Veltar strategic thinking had proven consistently accurate. "We come seeking terms," High Counselor Thexalon began, his bioluminescent patterns displaying the formal configurations of diplomatic submission. "The Veltar Empire acknowledges that our initial assessment of human capabilities was inadequate." Abebitunde smiled with the warmth that had made her legendary in diplomatic circles. "We appreciate your honesty, Counselor. But before we discuss terms, perhaps we should discuss understanding." What followed was unprecedented in galactic diplomatic history. Instead of formal negotiations, the humans initiated what they called a collaborative knowledge exchange. They weren't interested in traditional concepts of victory or surrender. They wanted to understand why two intelligent species had found themselves in conflict. Yuenli presented holographic models showing the fundamental differences between Veltar and human cognitive architecture. "Your species evolved for optimization and efficiency," she explained. "Ours evolved for adaptation and innovation. Neither approach is superior. They're simply optimized for different types of challenges." The revelation that emerged from the discussions challenged everything both species thought they knew about intelligence. Dr. Yvanas, participating as the Veltar's leading expert on human psychology, found herself learning more about her own species' limitations than about human capabilities. "You perceive reality as a puzzle to be solved," Mikhailovich observed, his musician's ear detecting subtle harmonic patterns in Veltar speech that revealed emotional states. "We perceive it as a symphony to be improvised. Both approaches have value, but they create completely different responses to challenge." Young Zara Moon, speaking with the directness that only children could manage, cut to the heart of the matter. "You studied us like we were broken machines that needed fixing, but we're not broken versions of you. We're something completely different." The breakthrough came when the human delegation proposed something that no Veltar strategist had ever considered: collaborative exploration instead of conquest. They suggested that the vast differences between their species' cognitive approaches could be complementary rather than competitive. "Your analytical precision, combined with our improvisational flexibility, could solve problems that neither species could address alone," Abebitunde proposed. "Instead of seeing our differences as obstacles, we could treat them as resources." High Counselor Thexalon experienced something unprecedented in Veltar psychology: genuine curiosity about alternative possibilities. The humans weren't demanding reparations or territory. They were offering partnership based on mutual intellectual exchange. The negotiations evolved into something entirely unexpected: a joint research initiative. Human creativity would be paired with Veltar analytical precision to explore questions that neither species had previously considered approachable. Dr. Yvanas found herself working directly with human researchers, discovering that their chaotic thinking patterns could identify solutions to problems that had stymied Veltar science for centuries. Meanwhile, human teams gained access to Veltar analytical tools that could refine their innovations with unprecedented precision. The first joint project involved developing new approaches to interstellar travel. Human intuitive physics, combined with Veltar engineering precision, produced breakthrough technologies that neither species could have achieved independently. Within months, the conflict that had begun with Veltar assumptions about human weakness had transformed into the most productive scientific collaboration in galactic history. The primitive species that had been targeted for conquest became the catalyst for revolutionary advances in Veltar understanding of intelligence itself. "We came to conquer what we perceived as a weak species," High Counselor Thexalon reflected during the final ceremony, establishing the Human-Veltar Scientific Alliance. "Instead, we discovered that strength and intelligence take forms we had never imagined possible." Abebitunde responded with characteristic human warmth. And we learned that the universe is far more interesting when different forms of intelligence collaborate rather than compete. The great irony was complete. The aliens who had claimed humans were weak now studied them not to understand defeat, but to comprehend a form of victory that transcended conquest, the triumph of collaboration over domination, creativity over control, and understanding over assumption. In the end, humanity's greatest victory wasn't defeating the Veltar Empire, but transforming it into something neither species had been capable of becoming alone.